and loud. Good morning and welcome to session number 2, Distinguished Professors. Before we get started, I'm Michael Hotaling with CNS Companies, and I have the great pleasure of being the moderator for this session. This session is sponsored by DWL Architects and Planners and HMH Shore Harris Miller Miller and Hanson. Normally being a moderator is a heavy lift, but I'm blessed to have an easy lift given my 2 panelists. Given the college theme, we chose together to create it like debate club. So what you're going to witness today is somewhat of a debate. We have a few topic areas we're going to cover with some pre-scripted questions for our speakers, and I'll let them introduce themselves in just a moment. And then we will have opportunities for the audience to engage in this session as well. I would ask some ground rules for all of you to abide by as we get into audience participation portions of the session. Those would be to avoid specific cases. If you want to tag onto a topic, please keep it generic. Otherwise, our speakers may not be able to address and respond to your questions. Be brief. Time will go fast, and lengthy stories will not allow us to get out of here on time, so be brief. Be hard on the issues, but easy on the people. So don't make it a personal attack, but make it about the issues.
I'm not sure I agree with that one.
And most importantly, be open to other opinions that may be counter to what you believe. So this will be a debate format, and we will open it by allowing the speakers to introduce themselves. And I'll let Peter introduce himself first, then hand over this mic to Elliott.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk, we hope, about a couple of issues of interest, I think, to most airports around the country, particularly focusing on land use and non-aeronautical land use at airports. I'm Peter Kirsch. I'm a lawyer who practices entirely in the realm of airport law, and I live in Denver, Colorado, but I spend my time almost everywhere else, it seems, these days. And I've been doing this work for 25 years, maybe, some lengthy period of time, handling...
It feels like 37.
You can't interrupt me unless I interrupt you first. We work on issues at airports large and small, everything from airports like O'Hare and LAX down to small general aviation airports. And the reason I think that this issue is particularly interesting today is that the era when airports sat on vacant land and just thought of it as vacant land, I think, is all over. Airports are now beginning to realize in many respects they are a huge real estate landlord, that they sit on a very valuable asset in their real estate. And airports are getting more entrepreneurial. Airports are getting more business-like in saying, I have vacant property, can I generate revenue? And at the same time, so are their users. Their users are saying, that vacant lot across the street, that big piece of vacant property at the end of the runway, why don't you develop that so that you can lower my rates, so that my rates and charges stay reasonable? And by the way, the airport down the road has lower rates than you have, therefore there's a competitive advantage to raising money. And so airports are moving from being, if you will, just public service providers of a place for aircraft to land and take off and to be stored, into more of an entrepreneurial business model. And we're seeing this all over the country, from the largest to the smallest airports, are looking at opportunities to develop their property in a way that, frankly, generates money for the airport.
Thank you, Peter. Elliott?
All right, with that, I'd like to thank you all for coming. Enjoy lunch. And okay, so hi, I'm Elliott Black. I'm with the FAA in Washington, D.C. I'm the director of the Office of Airport Planning and Programming, a phrase that is utterly meaningless outside of our 4 walls. We deal with planning, environmental, and financial matters, but we work very closely with our colleagues in the Office of Airport Safety and Standards and other parts of the agency as well, not to omit the Office of Airport Compliance. I'd like to introduce myself by telling people that I'm a recovering architect who learned how to balance a checkbook. I've been in the aviation industry for coming up on 30 years now, although it amazes me when I sit back and realize that and do the math. It doesn't really feel like that. I started off as a consultant. I started with Day & Zimmerman in Philadelphia a very long time ago. I've held positions at 2 airports, Boston Logan and Chicago O'Hare, and I promised when I became a Fed 12 years ago that I would not forget what it's like to be an airport operator. And then when I joined the FAA, I spent 5.5 years in the Great Lakes region. I'm going to assume that that's my second iPhone or something like that. Or is that your way of censoring me? Okay, that's also good. Anyway, but I also promised myself that when I joined the FAA, I would not forget what it was like to be an airport operator, and then when I moved from the regional office to headquarters, I promised that I would not forget what it's like to work in the region. And this is a very rich area of policy analysis. And Michael, when you introduced us, you said debate club rules. I assume that means we're going to have to change sides halfway through. Peter grins evilly. Not so much. At any rate, as is always the case, it will always shock Peter to learn that I agree with the vast majority of what he says. It's the margin where things get difficult. We get it. We absolutely recognize the importance of non-aeronautical development, and we recognize that it can be a very good thing in certain circumstances if certain other circumstances fit. So we want to talk about what those circumstances look like, what the considerations are, what the process needs to look like, and what we encourage airports to do, and what we are trying to do within the FAA to be supportive and work collaboratively with due consideration of the interests of a lot of different stakeholders, some of whom have different opinions. And I'll stop there and we can get more into it.
Okay. Thank you, Elliott. And you both have framed the subject very well for aeronautical versus non-aeronautical land uses. I think for most airports you can agree that the airfield infrastructure is your #1 most important asset. But after that, typically, it's your available land holdings. So that was key to this particular part of the discussion. And our first kind of debate question, if you will, airport sponsors are faced with ever-increasing pressure to generate revenue through traditional sources. Whether an air carrier, airport, or a general aviation facility, the cost of doing business continues to rise, while revenue from traditional sources continues to remain flat or decline. So Elliott, you get first stab at this. So I'm going to ask you to name at least one manner in which sponsors can comply with the regulations and make use of available land for non-aeronautical uses, and kind of find the intersection of those two items.
Sure. So from my perspective, the single most important thing that any airport can do, whether you're a large hub, non-hub primary, commercial service, general aviation airport, from my perspective, it really doesn't matter. Planning is the single most important thing that you have to do. And when I say planning, I'm not just throwing that word out to be glib about it. The point is you've got to really think near-term, medium-term, and long-term about what the aviation needs are that your airport, or if you're a consultant or an attorney, the airport or airports that you support, what their true long-term needs are in terms of land use. Part of the reason that's so important, and I learned this lesson at, well, I already mentioned that I worked at Logan, so worked with Mr. Duvall back then, and I learned some painful lessons when you don't have a really good plan that's well articulated for all stakeholders to see. Part of it is being able to tell the story about what your plans are for that land, or why it is important to have land available, whether it's for aeronautical purposes or for simply, well, for protection of approaches. Naturally, that's important too. Protection against encroachment with respect to noise, protection against misperceptions that the land is simply lying fallow. That plan is the single most important defense you've got. Then, when you've got that plan, then you can actually start to make well-informed decisions about non-aeronautical development that don't jeopardize the aeronautical functions of the airport. That, from my perspective, is the single most important thing. I'll stop there because I could talk about that for about 4.5 hours, and you don't want me to do that.
You represent a number of sponsors and other entities in situations like this. How would you respond to Elliott's remarks, and what do the folks need to hear from an airport sponsor perspective?
My esteemed colleague from Washington, I think, is correct when he talks about planning. You're going to keep a score of how many times each of us says the other is correct, okay? He's correct when it comes to planning. He's absolutely right. That's only half the picture. How many of you have an ALP? Okay, great. Obviously, you all do, right? Okay. And your ALP shows on it areas that you have correctly planned for aeronautical purposes, for non-aeronautical purposes, for runways, runway safety areas, and so on. The ALP is really very, very important, and Elliott is absolutely right that it's important in a long-term sense that your ALP reflect what you're planning to do. Here's where the rubber meets the road. If the ALP shows an area that's not needed for aeronautical purposes, either it says for non-aeronautical or for airport-oriented development, there are different terminology that appears on different ALPs, at that point, I would argue the federal interest is over. That is, if the FAA has approved an ALP that says parcel A is available for non-aeronautical development, there is no need for any further FAA review beyond the obvious that applies both on and off airport, the 7460, the height limitations and things like that that apply to any property and the potential interference with airports. And the challenge is this. When an airport has a piece of property that's marked already as non-aeronautical, what should the FAA do? Should the FAA have approval rights over the terms and conditions of any lease? Should the FAA have to do environmental review before you can move forward with a project? Does the FAA get, in a sense, a yes-no vote on whether this is a good project or not? And I would argue no. I would argue that the FAA really has no further interest. And the reason this is so important is that if airports expect to participate in the real estate market, they are going to be participating in a competitive world with other landowners. Let's be frank about it, okay? There are other landowners down the road who would be happy to host that warehouse or host that distribution center. And if a prospective tenant comes to you and says, I would like to lease some property, and you say, that's great, I've got to go to the ATO, I've got to go to the region, I've got to go to Washington, I have to do NEPA, and we'll be back to you certainly within a year or two. That deal's gone. That deal is completely gone, and the airport's ability to develop goes from very exciting to very depressing. And so I think what we really need to do is to be very careful in defining the role of the federal government in this process. And so I agree with Elliott on the planning piece, but I would argue, Elliott, that once the planning piece is done, step back and let the airport sponsor make the decisions.
So Elliott, a couple of moments.
I have a bad habit of going like this a lot. That doesn't mean I agree. What that means is that I understand most of the words that are coming from my esteemed colleague's mouth here. All right? And I understood most of those words. There you go. Peter has the opposite predilection. At any rate, so first and foremost, and this is particularly important for those of you that are students, but really for everybody in the room. Mr. Kirsch, you included a supposition. You said, well, the planning is done. From my perspective, planning is never done. The aviation industry is a highly dynamic industry. It is constantly changing. The needs of stakeholders are constantly changing. An ALP is, for all intents and purposes, a snapshot in time. And yes, it's intended to capture the long-term plan. If you do a master plan properly and look truly long-term, that makes it somewhat more robust. But the ALP does not tell the entire story. The ALP can become, at least in part, almost obsolete the minute the ink is dry because things are changing. Now, I'm assuming that that's a sign that I'm saying good things, right? That the lights are coming up. Does it give me a little halo effect here? More to the point, if I may. So I agree, Peter, the question is out there. When the FAA has made a determination that a given parcel is available for non-aeronautical purposes, the question has been raised by other people. Does that mean that the federal government has no further interest? And this is an area where we are actively working. We are working with AAAE, with ACI, with other stakeholders, with certain attorneys who shall remain nameless, but they're based in Denver, to try to figure out where that balance lies, because we get it. We absolutely understand the competitive issue, and the lack of agility on one hand might jeopardize the ability of an airport to land a development deal. We understand that, and we are trying to figure out, is there a sweet spot? Is there a way, and in fact, Mr. Kirsch made the suggestion, perhaps there's a way that we could go so far as to pre-designate certain areas so that they could be moved more expeditiously through the process. We're exploring, are there circumstances under which we could undertake a so-called programmatic EA that could expedite the environmental review process? We've not ruled anything out in that regard. However, and this is a really important, this is a foot stomper message, particularly for those of you that are relatively new to the industry. It will happen. If you've got land that is sitting empty on the airport and people see that you're allowing or want to allow Burger King and Jiffy Lube and Super Target and everybody else to come in, you're going to get the question. You're going to get the question from the county executive or the mayor or city council, well, then why can't we use that property for the municipal vehicle maintenance facility at no charge? There are protections that come along with our bureaucratic rules. And those protections, in my experience, have been equally important to the nation's airports. And so one of the things that we have cautioned our colleagues in the industry about is be careful what you ask for. Because if we were able, and it's a big if we were able to draw a different conclusion about what the federal role is regarding land use, revenue use, and some of the other prohibitions and restrictions that come along with being federally obligated, you could potentially lose some critical protections along with that. And so we want to be very mindful and careful as we explore this. And again, don't get me wrong, we're actively exploring it, but we're trying to do this with due consideration of the needs of all of those different competing stakeholders.
So
Can I respond?
Please go ahead, Peter.
I think there's a bit of a red herring there. Nobody has argued, Elliott, that the revenue use rules don't apply. Nobody argues that. Frankly, anybody who does, I wouldn't take as a client. I mean, that's just foolish, okay? That there are laws, not regulations, that say how airport revenue can be used, and you have no discretion to say, sorry, okay, in this case, wink, wink, nod, nod, you can divert revenue. You can't do that, okay? So we're not talking about revenue use issues. We're not talking about the fundamental requirements of airport systems operating as a closed fiscal system. What we're talking about is making mechanisms available so that airports can move forward in a very competitive marketplace. Your point, planning never stops, is true from where you stand. It's really not true from where I stand. And that is that at some point you've got to call time out and say, I've done enough planning. We'll never have enough planning, to quote Elliott Black, but I've got enough. In other words, I know what my property can be used for, and I have a potential deal out there that will make money for my airport. And no, I can't promise you, Elliott, that my grandchildren won't need that for their vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, right? I mean, of course you can't ever do that. But you look reasonable period in advance, and that's why ALP approval is critical. Because once you're done with that process, it seems to me, judgments have been made throughout the agency and throughout the airport management that this is a good use of the land, and that at that point, that's my argument for why airports at that moment should be able to participate in the marketplace.
So let's take this just maybe a little bit further. Land use decisions are a local issue. So entity or municipality. Yet FAA regulations sometimes can constrict or restrain what they're able to do with that. Peter, you've already talked a little bit about it, but in a perfect world, what would an airport sponsor be able to do to make smart land use decisions for aeronautical versus non-aeronautical purposes?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really important issue, and I'll pick up on some of what Elliott said about planning. It is really important that airport sponsors plan and don't just willy-nilly make property available for whatever use comes in the door. And there are lots of different ways that FAA encourages and provides funding for planning, whether it be master planning or preparing ALP updates, or as the case may be. I think the distinction here is, or the issue here is, who is the decision maker? Or to quote a former person who used to stand up here at this podium, who's the decider? That we've got to make sure we understand what the federal role is and what the airport sponsor's role is. And so I don't think we are going to be able to inoculate ourselves against foolish decisions. Airports make foolish decisions. I don't think the FAA ever makes foolish decisions, but certainly airports do on occasion. And we have to accept that may happen so long as we follow a planning process that's reasonably robust and that considers first and foremost what are the aeronautical uses of this property. And that's why my point is that once an airport has entered into that process, presumably with a degree of public involvement, with involvement from the mayor or from the local political officials, and that decision has been made, that's the point at which airports should be allowed to participate in the marketplace.
Elliott, your thoughts and reactions to Peter's comments?
Well, lots of reactions, including the fact that I counted like 9 people that left the room while you were talking. Just for the record.
He gets one point for that one.
In all seriousness. So, again, I get what you're saying, Peter. The dilemma that we face is this. When we invest, when the federal government invests, we're investing money that was collected from users of the system with the intent that the facilities and the functionalities that an airport serves will then be available for the long-term public benefit. And I think you characterized it as a bit of a red herring to try to talk about land use and revenue use in the same breath. From my perspective, they are inextricably linked, and the principles are inextricably linked because they go hand in hand. It's fundamental, and it is statutory. It's not regulatory, although I grant you what Peter is going to tell you is that we're interpreting the law in a certain way, and there is truth to that, but we've been doing it that way for more than 50 years. So the point is that from our perspective, we think that we had a reasonably good balance going. We understand, again, the changes, but I also want to point out that there are times when the federal involvement can actually be helpful to an airport as a prospective landowner to try to land a development deal. As but one example, if you have two parcels of property on either sides of the road and one is federally obligated land because it's an airport and the other is not, but there happens to be a wetlands issue or a threatened and endangered species issue, the entity that is more likely to be able to secure the necessary permitting is frankly the one that has the federal imprimatur. Now, I'm making a bold assertion here, and I'm sure that Peter is going to contest it, but the point is it's not always. This is no one-size-fits-all solution here. The specific circumstances are always going to matter, and from my perspective, I would argue the federal interest does not get extinguished simply because we draw a box, or I'm sorry, the airport sponsor draws a box on the ALP, labels it non-aeronautical, and we approve that. If you were to pursue that a supposition that once we've approved it for non-aeronautical use and we therefore have no further oversight responsibilities, well, then you may as well go a step further and talk about actual release of the land for for sale. And there are times that we do that. There are other times when we will agree that for the near term, for interim use, that it's acceptable, but that we need to preserve the long term. And we can't abdicate our responsibility on behalf of the users who paid into the system to make those investments.
I think Elliott raises an important point, and we need to dig down a little bit on this, having to do with the federal investment. Not all airport property is alike. And there really, I mean, there are many, many different kinds of airport property, but for the purpose of this discussion, there are really three kinds. There's property that came to the airport through the Surplus Property Act. It was a gift from the federal government. I have no doubt that the federal interest in that is considerable, and by law, that must be used for aeronautical purposes unless the FAA formally releases that. And that property should, in many respects, be the last property that's ever used for non-aeronautical purposes. So that's category number one. Category number two is real estate that was purchased with AIP money. And that's partly what I think what you're getting at, Elliott, is the federal government has made an investment in that property. They have used taxes that the federal government collects for the purpose of purchasing that property. And I think as to that property, the federal interest is really quite considerable. And the FAA does have a process for allowing that property to be used for aeronautical purposes in certain circumstances. The third category is really, I think, where the rubber meets the road, where the real focus has to be, which is property that's been designated as part of the airport, but has no federal investment in that real estate. And that, at some airports, that's a very small amount of property. Some airports, it's a lot of property, depending upon how the airport has evolved over time. And I think it's important for airports to understand that in that respect, not all property is alike. If the airport has used its own revenue, not AIP money, not a gift from the federal government, for the purchase of property, or it's been gifted through various sources, I would argue the federal interest at that point is limited to the revenue use policy and the requirement that the revenue remain on the airport.
So, Peter, you kind of hinted at the no two parcels are alike. We're also dealing with a reality. I think many of the airports represented here are general aviation airports, or they operate a GA airport within a system of airports. The business model for a GA airport is much different than it would be for a Part 139 facility. So Elliott, maybe you can start off telling us a little bit about how FAA helps or works with sponsors that are running a GA facility, and is there anything different in that regard when you're working together with those sponsors?
Sure, absolutely. In order to respond to that, I do have to point out one thing from my learned colleague from Denver, and that is when you refer to an airport's own money, we have to bear in mind the FAA doesn't exist just to give out AIP funds or approve PFC funds or approve ALPs. We have a duty and responsibility to balance the needs of all stakeholders. I'm just curious, any airline representatives in the room today? Or anybody here who's ever worked for an airline? Ever? Okay, I see one hand. So I would respectfully submit that if we had other airline representatives here, they would probably rankle at the phrase, the airport's own money. Because from the airline's perspective, it's their money, and from the perspective of their passengers, they're the ones who are actually, well, not writing checks, but using the credit cards to pay airfares. So my point simply is the federal interest goes beyond simply Surplus Property Act and AIP. We have a duty and responsibility to protect the interests of all stakeholders. Now, to your point, Michael, for GA airports, for non-primary airports, if I may, yes, the dynamics are very different. The dynamics are different in terms of the magnitude of the facilities, how the land was acquired. Yes, those airports may be more reliant upon AIP funding for critical infrastructure projects, but in many cases, those airports are not financially self-sustaining, and we absolutely recognize that. And indeed, one of our own grant assurances is that we expect airports to be as economically self-sustaining as possible. And for that reason, that's why I say, there may be a misperception out there that the FAA is opposed to non-aeronautical development, and that is emphatically not the case. It is, however, the case that we have to be able to balance that non-aeronautical revenue development against the aeronautical needs of the airport, short-term, medium-term, long-term. So again, I'm going to come back and say it again, the planning is the most important. And that, again, I'm not just talking about lines on the drawing, I'm talking about taking a good, hard, honest look at what the needs are, but we absolutely will work with airports that come to us with proposals. The earlier we can be aware of it, the better, because again, we're trying to figure out, is there room, is there trade space, if I can use that now hackneyed term, for us to come up with a process that enables us to be more agile, to in turn allow the airports to be more agile when opportunities arise, without necessarily completely abdicating our responsibilities to ensure that the airports don't get pressured into making too quick a decision, because we have seen that happen. And we have seen airports that entered into agreements, made commitments for land or whatever, and then had to dial them back because they forgot that there were federal rules attached to how the land or revenue were used, because they do go hand in hand.
And Peter, in reaction to that, and in particular, are there regulations that you've observed that make it more difficult for a GA airport to deal with this?
I think Elliott's points are largely correct, that the self-sufficiency requirement is really important, and I would certainly not argue that, at least as to most FAA officials, they're not opposed to non-aeronautical development. I think, again, it comes back to the question of, perhaps sounding a bit paternalistic for the FAA, it's our job to protect your money as a former airline employee, or it's our job to protect the users of the system, as though airport directors don't have that same interest. And I think this is an issue that regrettably is pretty common outside the airport realm in politics as to how much should be dictated by the federal government and how much should be a local decision. And I would argue that within the parameters of the existing regulatory structure, which is pretty severe in terms of the restrictions on how money can be used and how real estate should be used, that those ultimate decisions really should be a local decision, because I actually do trust airport directors as having the best interests of the hangar owners and the GA users and the airlines if you're a 139, and that, with no disrespect intended to Elliott or his colleagues, that those should fundamentally be local decisions, not ones made at the region or the ADO or the Washington level. That we, in fact, understand, airport directors understand what their local needs are at least as well as the FAA, and in many respects are at least as able to protect their budget from theft from downtown. If they want Elliott's help, I'm sure they'll come and ask for it. But I don't see that decision is one that the federal government has to be making.
Any reaction, Elliott?
So lots of reactions, some of which I can articulate in public. We'll have a glass of wine later.
Afterwards, yeah.
Exactly. No, I mean, so no one should misconstrue the FAA's position as suggesting that we are in a better position to make local decisions. But we do have an obligation to think critically and review what the needs are of the airport as the airport has dictated. We're not the ones that commission planning studies. We're not the ones that actually try to decide, well, where should facilities go? That is fundamentally an airport responsibility. But it is emphatically our role to review that work, test the thinking, raise questions, question assumptions, and be sure that everything is thought through properly. Now, I get it. Again, what Peter's trying to suggest is that the line ought to be drawn somewhere else, that perhaps maybe our role ought to be more advisory in nature as opposed to an approval. And again, we're actively exploring this as a policy issue, but again, that comes with a lot of ramifications, because there are a lot of times it happens. I mean, it happened as recently as Friday that I had an airport in our offices basically pleading with us to be the ones to write a letter to explain why they couldn't do X, Y, and Z, because they lack the authority to stand firm against other state or local or even federal agencies. And those protections are a really important part of the overall balance. So again, all I'm saying is, as we explore this as an industry, we need to be careful that we don't undermine those protections that are so important.
So let's go to the audience for a moment. David has a mic, and I would ask you to wait for the mic to get to you. are there, within the realm of this aeronautical versus non-aeronautical land uses, are there questions you'd like to have addressed? In particular, if you can phrase it in a way that both Elliott and Peter can react to it, kind of in point counterpoint. I think we have one in the back here, David. Gentleman in the back.
If it's a question about lunch, we can answer that too.
And please identify yourself before you ask the question.
What are you serving? Can you hear this?
Not exactly.
I had a question about, I'm former airport manager in Nevada, and that's not the important part, but the interesting thing is I understand under Internal Revenue Code, bonded airport indebtedness, whether it be double-barreled revenue and general obligation, where are we going for our airport system in terms of financing?
All right, well, that's a question that shouldn't take more than about 7.5 days to answer. Where are we going with airport financing? I mean, here again, I'll just jump in and let Peter respond. But from our perspective, we're not the ones that dictate how airports decide what to build or how to fund it or how to go about the cost recovery, except to the extent that federal law does require us to look at certain things. For example, airports that meet certain criteria, we have to look at competition plans before we can approve PFC applications or award additional grants. That really is, by and large, a local decision. Yes, we look at rates and charges, policy, and we look to be sure that everything is going to work within, but we don't dictate where the industry is going. We don't know what's going to happen. We know there are people out there calling for a PFC increase. The last 5 presidential budget proposals provided for a PFC increase, along with some restructuring of AIP accordingly. But I can't predict where the industry is going in terms of financing capital projects. Peter, do you have other reactions?
I think you've hit on, frankly, the reason this debate is important. It's no secret that AIP money isn't as good as it once was, not because the federal government's money isn't good, but because there's not as much of it. PFC has not been increased for a long time, and I'm not one who's going to take a bet on the fact that Congress will increase the PFC this year. They don't seem to be particularly in a generous mood at the moment. And so when we have declining PFC or effectively declining PFC revenue, we have effectively declining AIP revenue that the FAA has nothing to do with. We've got to find money somewhere else. And as airports look elsewhere, maybe it's in bond indebtedness, maybe it's private investment, maybe it's real estate development, but the era when airports could rely upon the user fees from the airport and the AIP money, and if you're a 139, your PFC, and that's it, and you don't have to look for any other source of money. Those days, I'm sorry, those days are gone. We have to look under every couch for pennies now. And that's one of the reasons I think that non-aeronautical development is so important, and the reason that I argue to Elliott that we need to see a paradigm shift in how the federal government looks at these other sources of revenue as being not just nice, useful, okay, but actually indispensable, I would argue, in order to keep our rates and charges at a level that the users have come to expect.
And I don't disagree with that in principle. One of the things that we have had a lot of airports do is come to us with proposals to sell property for a one-time infusion of cash to undertake projects. And we've had to push them really hard to think carefully before you do that because you're giving up potential future revenue streams. And in many cases, we have encouraged airports to retain the property expressly because they may be able to lease it for non-aeronautical revenues. And again, I don't want anyone to misconstrue that we are opposed to that, but it has to be done with careful consideration.
I think you're more generous, Elliott, than I would be. I would say any airport that wants to sell property should have their head examined. Okay, great, you're going to get a lot of money this year, but losing the protections that Elliott gives us, thank you, in terms of future revenue, makes selling airport property, except in the most extraordinary circumstances, really quite foolish in my mind.
Do we have another comment or a question coming over here, preferably within the land?
With regards to non-aeronautical land use, I think we can argue that there's already protections in place for the airline's money, and we don't need to worry about that necessarily on non-aeronautical use. But hearing terms like the FAA still has interest and there's protections in place, to me equals concern about liability. So has there ever been an instance where there has been thought, you want to be the decision maker, can you then become the liability holder? And has there ever been tried to come up with an agreement for non-aeronautical use that releases the federal government of any potential liabilities with regards to an agreement coming forward?
Well, there shouldn't be any federal liability. I mean, the liability is to the airport. If the airport has misspent money or entered into an agreement in violation of federal law, it's the airport that's going to be liable. And in most cases, the FAA is going after the airport, not the ultimate user. I mean, I guess I could spin a story of some scenario in which the feds would be liable, but I don't think it's a liability issue from the FAA's perspective.
I don't know that I would say it's a liability issue. I mean, when you use the term liability, in my mind it goes automatically to a slightly different issue. It's not entirely divorced from this one, but I'll mention it, and that has to do with runway protection zone property, particularly RPZs that fall off of airport property, and what the FAA's expectations are of an airport. That's the realm in which I think liability comes into play. But sometimes it's also about non-aeronautical development within the RPZ on airport property. I don't know that liability is where my personal concern is. Again, it really has to do with the expectations that have been heaped on us in the form of the way the law is written and the way, again, that law has been interpreted and applied for many, many decades. But it's an interesting question. I'm glad you asked that. We'll have to think about that.
We'll take one more on this subject, and we'll switch subjects. So,
Will Hamilton, City of Redlands. One thing that I've come across too, as far as looking at the possibility of future expansion, even on airport-owned property, is two elements. One is endangered species, and the other was cultural preservation due to Native American tribes, especially anybody in California, AB 52, and they need to notify tribes. And once you have at least 4 or 5 to a dozen tribes jump in because of the location of the land, sometimes it makes it, almost undesirable to even consider using that land for anything because of the steps that you have to go through with both of those two elements. So in the case where if you don't really think you'll have use for the land, what other options would be on the table if you're still trying to use it in some kind of certain way to generate revenue for your airport, especially with the small general aviation airport where revenue streams are hard to come by?
I think you have seized on one of the reasons why FAA review and approval is so problematic. There are a number of laws that apply to the federal government when the federal government takes action. Endangered Species Act, tribal consultation, historic preservation, Section 4F of the Department of Transportation Act, which protects parkland. Those apply when the FAA takes action. And as a result, your point is absolutely well taken. If we have a project, whatever the project is, that requires FAA approval, that whole range of environmental statutes is triggered. If there's no FAA involvement over here, then you're simply under your state law, and your state law may have a number of environmental protections. Certainly in California, CEQA is not insubstantial. But then you have to comply with state law, not federal law. And that's the reason why engaging the feds, involving the feds, having the feds make a formal decision introduces a level of uncertainty and time that in many cases is extraordinary, even for what may seem to be a relatively modest project. And that's not Elliott's fault. That's not the FAA's fault. That's how the law is written. The law is written that if there is a major federal action that significantly affects the human environment, we have to go through environmental review. And if the FAA takes certain action, it has to consult with tribal interests. And if it takes action that affects parkland, it has to do something and so on. And so the whole point is, if we can figure out a way, as Elliott has pointed out, to pull back the federal interest, pull back the federal involvement, then that whole panoply of laws would not be triggered.
And if I may respond?
of course.
This is a lovely theory, yet to be tested, and I would respectfully submit that it will be tested. If we were to make that change, and we'd have to go through public notice and comment, and we would have to go through a lot of steps, and we'd have to convince an awful lot of attorneys, by the way, internal as well as external. And I personally would be amazed if that decision in and of itself was not subject to legal challenge by any number of groups for precisely the reasons that you raised. There are other federal agencies. There are many other constituent stakeholders. So I just don't think it's as simple as saying, oh, you know what, FAA just doesn't have to make a decision anymore about that. They just have to approve the box, and then they can wipe their hands and step back. I don't think it will be that simple. I'll leave it at that.
So let's adjust course a little bit and pick up on the topic of financing as it came up. And I think, Peter, you alluded to the availability of AIP just isn't what it once was. The value of it isn't what it once was. Yet the industry generally remains addicted to AIP for a lot of good reasons. but those AIP dollars come with strings attached. In your work with sponsors, what do you notice about that in terms of those strings that come attached, and you'd want FAA to be alert to or thinking about what could they be doing differently going forward relative to those strings that come attached?
Isn't this an example of the golden rule? He who has the gold makes the rules. I mean, look, the fact is that let's go way back before most of us were born and the current federal funding system was set up. The principles were very clear, which is that local governments should operate airports. I mean, we're going back here before the Second World War. But there was a lot of concern that local governments could not generate enough revenue just from operating airports, or they would be loath to use their own tax revenue for the capital costs of an airport. And that's how the predecessor to AIP was born, that the federal government would provide substantial capital investment in our national aviation system, much as they did with the interstate highway system, by the way, but that the local government would be responsible for maintenance and for operation of the facility. Of course there's strings attached. There have always been strings attached. Are today's strings more than yesterday's strings? I don't know, and I don't care, because that's the deal. That's the deal we struck as an industry to say that if we want FAA money, then now there are 30 grant assurances. Maybe in the 30s or 40s there are less than 30, but that's not the point. The point is that so long as we are taking federal money, that's the deal we strike. Should we continue to take federal money? Well, for 99.9% of the airports in the country, the answer is absolutely. I need that money. Yes, I will take all those strings attached. So I'm not particularly worried about that. That's the way it's always been.
Elliott, would you comment on in your work directly with the sponsors, what you hear from them, and how you take that learning and consider those grant assurances and other obligations?
Sure. I would just make the point. In 12 and a half years with the agency, I've never yet had an airport come to me and say, hey, we're thinking seriously about no longer taking money because it's not worth it to us anymore. I've not heard that. But that has not stopped us from listening and really being attentive and open-minded about this issue because, again, we hear not just Mr. Kirsch, but other people being very articulate, AAAE included, about the need to take a fresh look at this. So we are examining it. But I don't want anybody to misconstrue that as, you said, he who has the gold makes the rules. We do this collaboratively. And so I want to be sure that nobody in the room misconstrues that as, well, we've just made up our minds, this is the way it's got to be, period. Yes, I personally make all these rules. If Kate Lang were here, and I learned very well from Kate, she would say, we're not that mean and we're not that clever. This is a collaborative industry. Congress actually writes the laws. We work with a lot of different stakeholders to be sure that we're interpreting those laws in a reasonable manner. I did also want to harken back, if I may, and I apologize for diverting back from the finance, but you mentioned one other point. You referred to threatened and endangered species. That's another issue behind all of this. I do want to make sure that you're all aware. We are engaged with another federal agency that shall remain nameless, but its initials are the Fish and Wildlife Service, and they're under a great deal of pressure to designate critical habitat and airport property is a very attractive thing for them. And so we're actively engaged with them to protect against encroachment by that type of limitation as well. And that's an area in which, again, frankly, I think we're bringing benefits to the table as opposed to letting this sort of impression be out there that it's so crushingly burdensome to be federally obligated. There are great benefits to airports to have our, yes, somewhat bureaucratic and maybe paternalistic hand in it, but we do work all these issues together. So again, I've not heard any airport, and in fact there was one certain large airport in this state many years ago that did not take AIP funds for quite some time expressly because they did not want to be burdened, but they then decided that it wasn't worth it, that they were better off getting the federal funds. So unless somebody comes to me with an example, I mean, I've not heard of an example.
I think it will always be a very, very, very small number of airports could ever survive without AIP money. There was a short-lived effort a couple of years ago by a couple of the largest hubs, 5 or 6 of the hubs, who wanted to tell the FAA where they could shove their money, and that didn't last very long for just the reasons Elliott points out. There's a lot of money there. Now, at the end of the day, will Congress someday reduce AIP entitlements if you increase your PFC revenue, or will they reduce AIP entitlements to small airports? I don't know. That's not something the FAA has authority over. But I think there is a possibility, if non-aeronautical development becomes successful, that the need for AIP money at airports that sit on huge pieces of real estate. I mean, I'm thinking of DFW or Kansas City or Denver that sit on massive real estate holdings, that maybe AIP money wouldn't be needed for those airports.
So I would just respectfully point out that some of those airports that you've mentioned, one in particular in the great state of Texas, generates a staggering amount of non-aeronautical revenue today, already from natural gas. And yet...
And real estate development.
And real estate development. And yet, they've not stopped coming to us for AIP fund requests. So, again...
That's right.
Could it happen someday? Sure. But a lot of other things could happen someday. And we have to deal to some degree with the here and the now.
So we've got one pre-structured topic left, but I'd like to park that for a moment because I want to give the audience a chance to maybe raise topics that aren't in the realm of what we've already talked about. Are there topic areas that you'd be interested in hearing from Elliott and Peter, their perspectives on those topics, with 10 minutes left in the session?
I thought she was waving you off. She's like, no.
No, she's giving me 10 minutes.
Let us go.
The 10-minute mark. Are there topic areas you'd like to hear from both of them on? Again, remembering, David, we've got one back here to your left. Remember the ground rules again. Keep it general. Keep it brief.
I'm not meaning to take this over, but airport security, Part 1542. What is your take on this battle between TSA and GAO? And where are we going in terms of badging and other aspects of the sterile area and so forth?
So there are, I think, 46,000 people in the FAA right now, and 45,909 of them are more qualified than I am to answer your question. I apologize. I'm simply not prepared to respond to that.
I will tell you just very briefly. I think TSA is suffering from mission creep, and from the beginning. Thank you. I think the challenge is a real political one, which is that there's motherhood, there's apple pie, there's baseball, and there's security. And so very few local officials, and certainly no airport officials, are going to tell the TSA, we think you are requiring too much security at my airport. It's a problem, but every couple weeks I get a call about mission creep where the TSA has decided we want to have control here. And lucky for Elliott, he's not in charge of TSA.
Elliott's just in charge of the AIP checkbook.
And most other things at the FAA. Sorry.
So we have another.
I've got one.
Please.
Yeah, General Aviation Airport. It's a non-aeronautical tenant question. So 20 years ago, a developer comes to the city, sees a property on the airport, agrees with the city to build a series of maintenance hangars and other buildings within those hangars, rent it to the various aviation maintenance shops, flight schools, but one particular floor is a non-aeronautical tenant. 20 years, the building reverts back to the city. Now the airport is the landlord. I want to move that non-aeronautical tenant out because the other aeronautical tenants want to expand. How do I stay out of trouble? Can I do that?
You send an email to kevin.c.willis at faa.gov. Again, I apologize. That's not an area in which I am particularly well versed. I don't know if any of my colleagues from FAA are in a better position to respond.
I mean, since I'm not in charge of this, I would say do it.
Have I mentioned that the benefit of sometimes having the FAA step in before you just blindly listen to your learned counsel?
It's non-aeronautical on an aeronautical property. Come on, guys.
Right.
I think, Elliott, I think this is simple, even though you're not Kevin Willis and you don't really look all that much like Kevin Willis. It's an easy one, I think.
That said, we have Mr. Dave Cushing here, who used to work in the Office of Airport Compliance and is now the Los Angeles ADO manager.
Yes, but I'm having computer problems because after 5 years of being Los Angeles ADO manager, my computer just, on its own, reverted back to compliance. Like I'd never left.
It was in preparation for this question, Dave. Come on.
Oh, yeah.
I believe you can check out.
I lose
you
my
never
account.
leave, Dave.
Well, you're talking about hangar space. Office space. Oh, yeah. Well, we definitely, there's an interesting question about when it looks like on the ALP, it could be considered aeronautical, but it's actually a different floor. I've seen that. But, I mean, honestly, I think Peter's right in this case that if it's not a hangar, we're not going to cover it in the next presentation, for one thing. But that you can do whatever you want with our non-aeronautical entity, and then the argument is going to be from the tenant that they're really aeronautical, or they have some sort of aeronautical feature that they would argue provides them with federal protection. But if it, then you don't have to pick up the phone and call us. Yeah.
I would suggest further dialogue on this before you take that to the bank. But
Thanks, Dave.
No, I like Dave's answer. Let's stick with
I'm
that
sure
one.
you do.
The usual rule with the
And Dave's a smart guy. The one thing I can tell you, if I've learned anything with the FAA, it's any question that gets asked, the answer is you get out the magic AIP ball and you shake it, and you look, and the answer is it depends. There might be some additional bit of information that we don't have, so it's hard
On the other hand,
it's hard to
Elliott,
make judgments on the fly.
on the other hand, when you get the answer you want, stop.
That was
So
a
with,
great
with,
sound.
with 4 quality minutes left, let me tap one more topic very briefly, if you two are okay with that. And this is the next gen implementation item, but a lightning round of that. So the implementation has been garnered a lot of media attention, particularly in the community reactions to that. Peter, first, in about a minute or so, can you share the kind of the challenges that rollout created, and then we'll let Elliott react to that.
Yeah, I think probably Elliott and I share these challenges. FAA is a very siloed organization, and air traffic has a lot to learn on how to engage airports and how to engage communities, and a lot of the FAA airport staff is working really hard to train their colleagues across the hall, and I think they're making some incremental progress. It's really hard. I mean, the mistake I think we've all made is assuming everybody at the FAA knows each other and that they know what's going on in one division. And I think we've learned the hard way that air traffic and airports are not the same.
Airports meaning the office.
FAA airports,
yes.
I'm sorry, yes.
All right, so just in response to that, I recognize it may look that way from the outside. I think there's actually a lot more going on inside and much more progress being made than perhaps external stakeholders see. There's a great deal of dedication to addressing this all the way up to and including the administrator, and we're going to talk more about that in a session toward the end of the day today that is specifically about noise, and noise is but one issue associated with NextGen. So I think if it's okay, maybe we can defer delving too deeply into that. But there are a lot of very hardworking, dedicated, talented people across the agency, including the Air Traffic Organization, who are acutely aware of and working very hard to address these very issues.
So I'm going to take the bold and courageous move of calling the debate a draw.
Mr. Kirsch will disagree with you on that point.
Vehemently, I'm sure.
As would you.
But I'd like to thank you both for being willing to engage in a format like this. I hope the audience found it entertaining, informative, fun, and that you gained something out of the process. And it's interesting and unique dialogue. We have speaker gifts for both of you, the certificates for the Wounded Warriors Project that were donated to in lieu of a bigger gift, and then the Gladys toffee. So I'll have that for both of you as well. We are headed to lunch on your own and back here at 2, but please join me in thanking these two gentlemen for this entertaining and informative session. Thank you so much, Elliott. Great job. Oh, that was great. Hopefully it was